Dr. Chao, your kids are young, but you do have if I remember correctly, a daughter who's at South Carolina. Do they listen to you at all for medical advice? Or do they think, like, does your 19-year-old or 20-year-old, does she think she knows as much as you do, even though you're a doctor?
Well, I think you probably could say she's actually back at home now because they
Yes.
ended at Thanksgiving and they're doing remote now. But you probably could have ended that sentence is, does she listen to you at all? Period. Forget the medical
Yes.
advice part. No, I joke about that. She's a very good kid. I think she listens to me, but I'm not sure, like a lot of teenagers, and I say this in the kindest of ways, I don't think she actually hears me.
Yeah, right. Well, I just spent the last, every minute that I have not been on air for the last hour, I have been arguing with my son about the fact that he needs to have more jackets and clothes on to go sit outside and watch a football game all day. And it's like he won't listen to me. And not that I'm an expert, but I have sat outside in cold weather and watched a lot of football games before. And when you're young and you do that and you get cold, you're like, yeah, this is a bad idea. I should have had more layers on. There's very few times when the weather's not warm that I've ever gone to a game and thought, oh, you know what? I brought too much to sit outside in the cold all day, right? Like, you can always take the jacket off. You can always take clothes off if you go to watch it outdoors. So anyway, and he doesn't listen to me. And we went to the Thursday night game, which actually ended up pretty cold between the Titans and the Colts a couple of weeks ago. And he was sitting next to me, and I was like, oh, it's kind of cold, huh? And I was like, oh, you should have listened to me and maybe brought a jacket. And now he's not listening to me again. Anyway, so I'm
Well,
curious. You are
Clay,
an
Clay,
expert in medicine. I'm curious if there's anything that a parent can do that makes his child listen, even if you have a particular level of expertise.
I think the way that I don't know that I got any more than that, except probably my strategy or my suggestion to you is that, Clay, you should bring an extra jacket, one more than you even think that you need, because when it gets cold, you're going to have to give him one of yours. Otherwise, mom's going to yell at you if he
Yeah, you
gets
know what I
sick.
did? To be honest, I was cold at the Titans Colts game, and I said, "You want my jacket?" And he was like, "Ah," and I was like, "Because I'm not giving it to you. Because you should have listened to me and brought an extra jacket." So the problem here is he's 10. He's going on his own without me. So that's why I was trying to get him all dressed and everything because he's leaving the house in the next 5 minutes. So we'll see how this goes. He's going to come back and claim that it was hot. I'm sure there was 100 degrees for the game. We're talking to Dr. David Chao at Pro Football Doc. All right, so there's a bunch of different injury-related stories out there. Also, a lot of COVID-related stories. I wanted to start with the CDC guidelines. They seem to me like they could be helpful in terms of helping in particular with the amount of time that somebody might have to quarantine if they were being contact traced, because now the CDC is saying 7 to 10 days as opposed to 14, and 7 days with a negative test. That's basically cutting in half the quarantine period.
Yeah, there's no question that the guidelines continue to change as we learn more about this novel coronavirus. And yes, the original 14-day quarantine ideas have now shrunk. And I guess as we learn more about it. But then again, in some areas, take the San Francisco 49ers, Santa Clara County, not only has banned contact sports, and the 49ers are now in Arizona to practice and
It's
play for
crazy.
their next two games.
Yeah.
Then they go to Dallas, and we talk about this in the OutKick article about to be published. Then they come back to Arizona to actually play the Cardinals. So 3 of the next 4 games are at State Farm Stadium. But then their final game is, in theory, back home in Santa Clara at Levi Stadium. But however, currently there is a 14-day quarantine after travel. So how do you go from Arizona 7 days earlier and come back and play that final game? So unless something changes, the 49ers are not coming back home the rest of this season. And in the irony of all ironies, the next 2 weeks or next 2 games, the New England Patriots will play in California, albeit Southern California, and stay in California, albeit the LA area, between the Chargers and Rams games. So irony of all ironies here.
We're talking with Dr. David Chao. Tua seems to have a injury issue of a sort that has led to Ryan Fitzpatrick coming back in. It's also paired maybe with not playing spectacularly well. What are you seeing from an injury perspective associated with Tua?
Well, I don't, it was a practice injury, so there was no video on it, but certainly a thumb is pretty important for a quarterback for grip and able to spin the ball, et cetera. But I think there's another factor besides the ones that you mentioned is the Dolphins are actually in the playoff hunt and chase. And in the end, would you rather have let's say 90% Tua or 100% Ryan Fitzpatrick right now to give you the best chance to win, especially as you mentioned when Tua hasn't always played that well. But I look at the upside. At least we're not talking about his hip.
Yeah, no kidding. Speaking of another quarterback that seems to have had a little bit of issues, and you were just talking about Arizona in terms of the relocation potentially of the 49ers, Kyler Murray's shoulder doesn't seem to be anywhere near 100%. Can you tell anything by watching him play whether this is a significant factor?
Well, there's no question it's a factor, but, certainly at this time of the year, going into week 13, I've always said that 85% is a good week for any NFL athlete, right? You're never 100% at this time. But 2 weeks ago on that Thursday game, Kyler Murray got dumped on his right shoulder, and by video, he suffered an AC joint sprain, and you separated shoulder, and you saw him wincing as he threw and finished that game. And yeah, he was not 100% this week. And as a matter of fact, this is the same injury that has knocked Sam Darnold out twice for multiple weeks, where the Jets had decided, look, if Sam Darnold can't practice fully, we're not going to play him. But Kyler Murray is the man for the Cardinals, so an 85% Kyler Murray is starting and playing. So I think that's the difference.
We're talking to Dr. David Chao at Pro Football Doc. Phillip Rivers, a guy you know well and have treated for a lot of different injuries over the years, seemed to injure his foot at the end of the game against the Packers. He was questionable all week. It didn't seem to me, the same punch in his maybe it was just a function of the Titans came out and played a lot better in all facets, but he certainly didn't seem to be 100% during the course of the game either. What did you have been able to glean from Phillip Rivers associated with that foot or toe injury that he might have?
Well, I don't want to reveal too much because I've actually had some, I can't violate HIPAA, but he actually injured it on a block. And yes, even though he's not a mobile quarterback and he's in the pocket, to be able to shift in the pocket and push off and throw, it is a deal for you whenever you injure your toe there in terms of for push off. But he's got a 230 plus consecutive game streak. He's not going to not play. It's Phillip Rivers. He's played through a lot worse, but you probably could put him in the category of another player that's not at 100% at week 13.
No doubt. What about Julio Jones? Has had a shoulder issue off and on all throughout the season. Hasn't been very healthy this year for the Falcons, but the Falcons obviously got a big win and played surprisingly well against the Raiders. What do you think about this Julio Jones shoulder injury?
Well, Julio Jones' current issue is more hamstring related, and that's been lingering. And he's a vet. He's played through a lot this year. You finally got a little bit of time off. You might make it back this year, but surprisingly, the Falcons have revived a little bit after their coaching change, and they could still make a little bit of noise. So I think he may try and play through.
We're talking to Dr. David Chao at Pro Football Doc on Twitter. Encourage you to go follow him there. What other injury issues are out there that you think could be significant as we get ready for the upcoming week of NFL action?
Well, I think it's a given, and we said it on Sunday, that the Giants won't have, the NFC East leading Giants won't have Daniel Jones for at least this week with his hamstring. It's one thing to say, okay, you got a hamstring and you can't really run the ball. Let's look at yesterday's game, RG3 right at the end of the first
half. Yeah, that's right.
His left hamstring, and he wasn't quite the same. He could still play, but he wasn't quite the same. He could play through that. here's the issue with Daniel Jones. The Giants and reporters may be saying it's not a significant hamstring on MRI, but it's significant enough that when he tried to play through his Week 12 game, from the pocket, he couldn't even throw. So if you can't even throw with a hamstring, I mean, that obviously indicates it's at least moderate, if not severe. So he's missing at least this coming week. And it may be several weeks before we see the same Daniel Jones, who has been a big run-pass threat, a little bit giraffe-like, but pretty speedy as he goes downfield. And he's pulled off some pretty big runs, and we may not see that for a couple of weeks at least. So
and not only that,
might be big.
When hamstring injuries happen, as you well know, and I think we've talked about before, they also are incredibly easy to aggravate because you don't necessarily know when you're back to 100% again.
And easier to aggravate in cold weather and wet, poor footing weather, which is what we're coming upon here in December.
Who else? Anybody else out there that we need to be particularly aware of for fantasy or gambling purposes down the stretch run?
Well, when you go to ProFootballDoc.com and the Field View and Injury Index, look, people know about the stars.
Yes.
The question is, what about the defensive line or the linebacking core or, the offensive line? Look, yesterday's game here, on the one hand, you hear all the complaints of the Ravens, but the Steelers had several people on the COVID list too, from Marquise Pouncey to James Conner to Stephon Tuitt. But in the end, the Steelers might have lost more than the Ravens yesterday because they lost Bud Dupree to an ACL tear.
Yeah.
They're already down Devin Bush. So now there's two key defensive players right there. And going forward, that might be something to watch. I always look for things in certain position groups, and Bud Dupree and now and paired with Devin Bush both being out, that's a big deal.
Yeah, there's no doubt at all about that. And you feel, I know it hasn't officially been announced, but based on the video footage and the way that you saw him being treated, the odds of Bud Dupree not having a torn ACL are pretty low in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I hope to be wrong there, but by video, and if you go to ProFootballDoc.com, I actually go through frame by frame to show you why I believe that is the case, and I hope to be wrong, and I'm sure they're going to wait for an MRI, but as I've told you before, Clay, in my 17 years in the NFL, I never walked off the field without knowing if an ACL was torn or not based on physical exam, and the Steelers know it too. They have a good medical staff, but the announcement typically is awaiting MRI.